Hey everybody, it's Emily at ARG Schooling. Today I'm going to be doing the first video in a series I'm beginning where I'm going to share about my favorite authors. So I've been wanting to do this video for ages and I could not figure out how to make this work without it being a super long video. So I finally realized, why not break it up into like smaller videos. So that's what we're gonna do. So basically I think it would be fun to share some of my favorite authors, the books that I've read, and like what my favorite books are, which ones I think would be the most approachable to start with. So that's what we're gonna do today. So I'm basically gonna combine each video where I'm gonna talk about two authors, and I'm gonna try to pair authors that I think like make sense together. They might not make sense to anyone else, but in my head they do. So today I'm gonna be talking about Grady Hendrix and Neal Shusterman. Why am I pairing these together? Because I feel like they both have a really quirky, thought-provoking writing style that kind of they don't really go together. They're not like this, they don't write the same kinds of books or anything, so this may not make sense outside of my head, but I feel like they kind of both write very like quirky and thought-provoking books. So I'm going to start with Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix is an American author. He's originally from South Carolina, and he's somewhat of an expert on horror and all things like horror movies, but also like horror books, specifically from the 70s and 80s. What I love about Grady Hendrix is his quirky sense of horror. I think his books are just such a fun, like wacky good time. Like all of his books take a trope that is familiar, but gives it just enough of a twist to make it into something fresh and new. He always brings something unique to the mix. His books are always this wonderful mix of disturbing, funny, and emotional. That's what I love in horror. I love when I can feel a lot of things while also being disgusted and scared. So his books are great for that. I also highly recommend searching out any podcasts, interviews, panels that he's done, because he is really interesting to listen to. He's really funny, and he just is like this wealth of knowledge about horror. So it's always a good time to listen to any of that stuff. So I definitely recommend checking that out. The books that I have read, I think I've read almost all of Grady Hendrix's books. There are a handful that I haven't gotten to yet, but I've gotten through a good chunk of them. So the books that I have read are my best friend's Exorcism, which is exactly what it sounds like, where it's like teenage drama. This is bordering on being YA, but it's definitely not YA. And it's a story about like best friends and that weird moment when your friendship seems to be unraveling, but you're not ready for it to let go yet. So you're like clinging on for dear life and fighting for that friendship, which is such a like really interesting way to tackle that kind of a story, is with exorcisms and demons. I read Horror Store, which is a book about like a haunted IKEA. And it's super weird and so much fun, and I love that the book itself feels like an IKEA catalog and that kind of thing. Like, it's one thing I can say about Grady Hendrix books is that he puts a lot of thought into like making it more creative and new and different, and like even like the formatting of his books and the book covers themselves are really fun and interesting. I read We Sold Our Souls. This one is about a band and like when it's broken up and fallen apart, but like one of the members has gone on and had this amazing career, and then the rest of them are trying to figure out like what happened to us. Really fun time. I read The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This one returns to the same like setting, the same town as my best friend's Exorcism, but like 10 years later, and now we're following a bunch of housewives and like stay-at-home moms as they form this book club and start to like feel like maybe their new neighbor isn't what he seems. This kind of reminded me of Fright Night, but make it like 40-year-old women dealing with it rather than a teenage boy, which is just a fun time. I thought this book was really good. I read The Final Girls Support Group, which is his take on the final girls trope And I thought this was great. This was a lot of fun. I love the creativity that went into this. Like, he took storylines that were familiar to everybody who watches horror movies. Like, if you're a fan of slasher movies, you're going to recognize each of these final girls, even though he never uses those specific movies, but you'll recognize them, and gives them like what does their life look like 20 years later, and like how have they managed to surviving that. And then, of course, someone's trying to pick them all off. It's a really good time. I read How to Sell a Haunted House. This is the most recent Grady Hendrix, and one of my favorites. This one deals with haunted houses, but it's really more about grief. And like I said, he does this thing where you just like laugh, you cry, you feel grossed out or scared. And this one is about like siblings dealing with the death of their parents and having to sell the house that they lived in, and the puppets that their mother created over many, many years of being in this like Christian puppet ministry. And yeah, really weird, fun time about, again, generational trauma and like dealing with grief and like the stages of grief over the course of the story. This one was really good. If I had to pick my favorite, I think it's definitely a tie between My Best Friend's Exorcism, which was the first Grady Hendrix that I ever read, and How to Sell a Haunted House, because both of those stories really pulled my emotions more than any of his other books ever did. And you know what? If you could make me cry, you've got me for life. The fact that those books both like made me cry, made me feel so many things. Those are my two favorite Grady Hendrix books. And I also would say that if you're just starting with Grady Hendrix, My Best Friend's Exorcism is probably the best place to start. I think it is one of the more approachable stories. I mean, we can all relate to a friendship that is beginning to unravel and like not being ready for that to happen. So I think that's a really relatable book. I also think How to Sell a Haunted House is really approachable as well. And like that's a thing that we're all going to have to experience at some point, is the loss of our parents or the loss of anybody close to us, and like how to handle that grief. So I think both of those stories are really relatable and approachable, and definitely like the best ones to pick up. But my third choice for that would be the Final Girl Support Group, but only if you're really into slashers, because I feel like you almost need to have that love of the slasher film for that book to hit you just right. Now let's talk about Neal Shusterman. Neal Shusterman is a prolific author. He's been doing this for decades now, and he writes mostly fiction for children and teens. So he has this massive backlist. I have not read nearly everything that he's written, but I've read quite a bit, so I can definitely call him a favorite author. So what I love about Neal Shusterman's work is that it is so thought-provoking, and like literally everything I've read so far has left a deep impression on me because like of how much like it made me think, and how much that I find myself like coming back to it. Most of his books I feel are very rereadable because it's so thought-provoking that you want to go back and start over and like experience it again. They all have really unique and interesting premise. He asks questions that like maybe you'd never thought to ask, and then you start going down the rabbit hole with him, trying to like unravel like, well, what would happen in that scenario, which I think is just always a good time. So let's talk about the books that I have read. I read Challenger Deep. This is a standalone that has to deal with mental illness, and specifically schizophrenia, which is something his son deals with. And so the book was sort of like written with him, and it's just a really interesting look into what that's like, both for the child and the parent, like experiencing like what that does to a person and their family, and how to better understand it, which I think is important. I love reading books that tackle big, heavy topics like this, and I think he does this in a really interesting way in this story. I read Dry, which is another standalone, and this one is a dystopian in which California runs out of water, and what that looks like in the immediate, like how people are dealing with it. I really enjoyed this one. I love stories about natural disasters. I love seeing like how people manage and like what that looks like. Like, I think we all kind of know enough about like apocalyptic situations that we think we know exactly what would happen. So I feel like it's always fun to like experience that from different authors' perspectives, and I really liked getting to experience it with Neal Shusterman's writing. I like that this was a standalone. It's wrapped up at the end, so like you get a full resolved story. I read Game Changer. This is one that I didn't love, but I still thought was such an interesting premise that I will probably at some point pick it up again and see if my thoughts have changed. This is a parallel universe story, which is something that I love, and we're following our character as he's experiencing different lives through different parallel universes until he can figure out how to get back. I didn't love the character we ended up following for this story. I think I would have been better off with a different character to experience all these things, because I just didn't find him interesting enough to stick with him for an entire story. But this was a standalone, and I give it points for thought-provoking plot line, but definitely wasn't my favorite. I read Bruiser. This one has stuck with me for a really long time. I read this like 2 years ago, and I'm still thinking about it. This is a story about a boy who experiences other people's pain and takes that pain from them and what it does to him. And it was beautiful. Like, this is a story that will make you stop and think about how we treat other people, about how we view our pain, and about how we put our pain on other people. It was just really moving. I read Full Tilt, which is another one that is not my favorite. I don't really remember details on this one besides that it's something to do with like a weird amusement park kind of a situation where each ride like is trying to help him in his, I don't know. This is one of his earlier books, and I don't really remember it in detail. I read Unwound and Unholy. I think half of Unsold, I think, is the next one in the series. I've still yet to finish the Unwind dystology, but I do want to at some point. But this is one of my favorite series, even though I haven't finished it yet. This one is super thought-provoking. I've talked about it many times because Unwind is one of my favorite books, but this is a story about what would it be like, what would happen if America had a war over reproductive rights. And it ends in a compromise in which abortions are completely illegal. And on the other side, when your child turns like 12, 13 years old, between the ages like 13 and 18, you can have your child unwound, where you're not killing them necessarily, you're harvesting them for organs. And because we have this newfangled technology and a whole flock of teenagers that we can unwind, things like major like illnesses, diseases, like lung disease, cancer, like all these problems are basically eliminated because you have organs and body parts that you can use to replace anything that was damaged. So like it's helping people, you know? So we're following a group of teens who are supposed to be getting unwound, and their experience is on the run. And like the world in this story is fascinating and horrific. And I almost qualify this as horror because there are some really, really disturbing elements and moments in this, at least in the first book. I don't know how many more disturbing things are going to happen later on, but like the first book has one of the most disturbing things I've ever read in any book, and I read horror, and this messed me up for a while, and then I read it to my kids because I'm mean and I like to traumatize. But this book is so good, and I definitely recommend it. This is one of my favorite books of all time. And then I read the Arc of the Scythe series. So that is Scythe, Thunderhead, The Toll, and Gleanings. This one, I think, is his magnum opus. I cannot fathom what he could possibly do to top this. Like, this is one of the best things I've ever read. This is a series that in my mind anyway, is set in the same world as Unwind. And if you read carefully, you'll notice some connection. I'm not going to talk about that here though, but I promise you that I'm convinced these are the same universe. But in the Ark of the Scythe series, we are following people who live in this new world in which we have eliminated mortality. We are more immortal now. We have gotten rid of all the illnesses, diseases. We can come back from any kind of damaged anything. Like, people splat themselves for fun by jumping off of tall buildings because that's the only way they can feel adrenaline. So, in this world, we have something called Scythes, because in order to keep the population under control, since you can't naturally die, you need to have some way to still kill people. So that's what Scythes do. They are state-ordained murderers who have rules that they have to follow, but the rules are built within themselves. Like, they come up with their own rules and codes that they have to go by. And there's no more, like, leadership as far as a president or a king or governments or any of that. Everything is run by the sentient cloud called the Thunderhead. This series, I think about this series all the time. This is my ancient Rome. I think about the Ark of the Scythe series on a daily basis, and I think it's brilliant. I think the things that he brings up in this story are so thought-provoking, so interesting, so well done. It makes me think about it constantly. I don't know. I think this is brilliant. I think this is probably the best thing he's ever written and the best thing he will ever write. And I want him to top it. I would love to have something new that's just as good as this, but I don't know what it would be. I don't know what he could possibly do. But this right here is my favorite. And then the last book that I have read by Neal Shusterman is Courage to Dream. This is a graphic novel of short stories all set during the Holocaust, and each story features like a different element of something from the Holocaust, like people in hiding or people working in the resistance. What else? I think that like the Dutch resistance or something like that, and how the Dutch tried to save a lot of people. Really thought-provoking stories. Again, I was a little bit nervous about it, just knowing that there was going to be a lot of like, the key of this story, this set of stories is like finding hope in the Holocaust, and when I realized there was going to be a lot of magical elements, I was a little bit worried that it would be not good. But I was very pleasantly surprised with this series of stories. They were all done really well. I thought they were really interesting, really good way to introduce the topic of the Holocaust to someone who doesn't really know a lot about it, because it touches on so many things. So those are the books that I've read by Neal Shusterman. Like I said, my favorite by far is the Ark of the Scythe series, followed closely by Unwind. Let me know down below in the comments which of these authors have you read from, and what are your favorite books by Grady Hendrix and Neal Shusterman. Would love to hear about it. Let's talk about it in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to see more things like this, I hope that you will like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.